Hello, folks. We are down the line from Boston tonight with political author, analyst, and historian Dr. James D. Boys. I'm Michael L. Roberts, and this is the return of the American Chronicle. It's Monday, the 23rd of March, 2020, and here we are in the opening throes of a transitioning global response to the coronavirus. With thanks to you all for your feedback after James's appearance on the Voice in the World podcast last week, it's a great privilege to restore the American Chronicle format here and bring it back to the digital waves of air after all too long an absence. For tonight's show, James and I compared UK and US responses to the crisis, discussing in the process that which President Trump's team is doing to continue operations uninterrupted, and the ever-relevant historical context in which the US president's actions can be judged. I began tonight's interview then by asking James what the feeling on the ground was in Boston.
We've seen a whole number of states now issuing a series of clampdowns by their state governors. Massachusetts issued one this morning, effectively saying that as of tomorrow, that's Tuesday, all non-essential businesses need to shut down, and that effectively there's going to be an all-effective curfew in place, except for going out for exercise and to get necessary items. So you really are seeing the shutting down effectively of American civil society in many respects, so that this virus, I think, should hopefully, in the view of the government at least, manage to basically quarantine itself over the next 2 weeks. We've already seen Donald Trump calling for markets and supplies to be reopened within 15 days. It's quite remarkable that he's made that statement just as states across the nation are starting to really tighten the grip effectively and shut down. So I think you are seeing something of a contradiction between the federal government and the individual state governments across the country.
On that point, here we've got the sense that certainly we're all closing down, as it were, for 12 weeks, if not much longer. And it's interesting to see clips of Donald Trump holding up a piece of paper that says 15 days as a potential fix. How much of a contradiction is that state-by-state response and language to the federal level Trump response?
Well, I think there is a disconnect between the federal government and the individual state administrations. And this isn't trying to play a political game here. You are seeing pretty consistent views coming from both Republican and Democratic governors across the nation, realizing the importance to try and quarantine this and to clamp down on it as soon as possible. If I'm honest, we've been expecting this here in Boston, I'd say, for about the last week. I think the administration here has been hesitant to try to impose such seemingly draconian measures, quite frankly. But when you see that it has been rolled out across some 7 or 8 states already, quite frankly, I'm of the opinion that it's going to be a device which is increasingly utilized by governors across the nation, which again will put it at a disconnect from the White House, which appears to be sending out quite a different message. And again, I think it's important to distinguish between some of the individuals working at the White House, at the cabinet level and an advisory level, who seem to clearly understand the importance of this, and perhaps the president who, for whatever reason, perhaps viewing his own political fortunes diminishing, is clearly trying to put a better spin on this. It's important to remember, of course, that Donald Trump has been touting the success and the strength of the American economy from, let's remember, the very morning he was elected, and how that has risen like a rocket ever since. So to see all those gains wiped out in the space of the last week or two must be terrifying, quite frankly, for Donald Trump when he looks ahead to the election this November.
You mentioned the individuals around Donald Trump there in the White House and otherwise. Obviously, the numbers, the figures of this disease are changing all the time, so it's hard to state anything categorically. But certainly, the last I read, I was aware that the United States was the third worst severely hit by this disease. In the UK, the daily briefings here, potentially signalled by Boris Johnson, might be becoming something delivered in a more remote fashion. What measures are the White House team taking around Trump to avoid contracting the virus, and to what extent might they be moving towards more virtual, remote briefings?
To be honest, it's a little difficult to tell. If you look at the physical dimensions of the White House, it is a very small building. The West Wing complex within which numbers of these people are either working or meeting is remarkably small, certainly by British standards. For those people who don't know, the White House press briefing room that the president has taken to using in recent days used to be the White House swimming pool. It is not a large area at all, and quite frankly, if you were devising a modern press advisory area starting from scratch, you simply wouldn't use that space because it is simply not up to scratch for the current era. So you're cramming some very, very important people with important decisions to make into a very tight space. And when you realize that these people have met and come into contact with people who've subsequently developed the virus, it seems remarkable, frankly, that there has not been a greater attempt to separate these people. Just at a very base level, the president and the vice president are routinely together, and you would have thought that just from a sort of a continuity of government point of view, that they would have been kept apart from one another. Let's not forget also that the Vice President Mike Pence is, at least in theory, in charge of the coronavirus task force, and the last thing you imagine he would want to do would be to get sick. He and his wife have taken the tests and have come up negative. The president has taken the tests and apparently come up negative. But we're starting to see members of Congress, senators come down with the virus. And we know that they have had contact with one another and with key advisors at the White House. So just in terms of the simple logistics of this, it seems clear that the virus will at some point penetrate the White House. We're hearing reports that Secret Service agents have come down with the virus. It really seems to be that at the senior levels, this administration, from the president down, there is perhaps a lack of seriousness being adopted with regard to the potential to transmit this simply from person to person due to physical proximity and contact.
Depending on the extent to which the UK audience here has its eye on US politics, they might have heard rumours of designated survivors being allocated and indeed President Trump being removed from office during this time. From a stateside position, James, could you speak to those notions, please?
There are actually discussions across Twitter and in the media about invoking the 25th Amendment, which of course would remove the president from office if he could get a majority of the cabinet and the vice president to agree. I think this is a remarkable development, quite frankly, and one which is perhaps unfounded, whatever one thinks of the president. To start talking about removing him from office at this point would perhaps, I think, seem unlikely and problematic. We have seen calamitous times on the markets. The question about whether the president is leading adequately is clearly a political one. I think that when you consider what has transpired over the course of the last weeks here in the United States, it has, I think, revealed what many people suspected, which is in times of crisis, Donald Trump has been seen to be wanting. Over the last 3.5 years, many people have, I think, felt it was thankful that the United States had not faced a crisis under Donald Trump for fear of what might have been revealed. And I think over the course of the last 3 or 4 weeks here in the United States, those fears by many, I think, have been revealed. And it will be interesting to see, I think, how that plays out into polling, which is going to take place, no doubt, over the coming weeks and months leading into the election in November. I should point out, however, that if you look at the map of where this virus is impacting the United States, at least at the moment, and I should point out that we're speaking here on, where are we, the 23rd of March, which I only timestamp because this is obviously a very fluid situation. If you look at a map of the United States about where this virus has impacted, it should be said it looks very much like it's focused upon, in many states, that favor the Democratic Party. And you can almost imagine why, if you're a Trump supporter in the Midwest, across great swathes of the country, between the Appalachians and the Rockies, you might well be looking at this and thinking, what virus? There is, in some cases, very little evidence of it. It does seem to be focused upon those core areas in California, here in the northeastern seaboard, in New York. So it will be interesting to see how Donald Trump's own supporters view this, and indeed whether there is a hemorrhaging of support for him and his handling of this, or whether, as is so often the case, this is just another one of those issues which would bring down any other president, but which seemingly is unable to taint Donald Trump.
In terms of the urban focus of the virus, therefore, would it be true to say that the heartland is not presently in as much economic need of a bailout as those major and, as you say, potentially largely Democratic voting cities?
Well, it's going to be interesting to see, actually, because, as we were discussing, the virus seems to be focused upon the large urban areas here on the northeastern seaboard, what's often called the Acela corridor between New York, Washington, and Boston, on the left coast, if you will, in Los Angeles, California, San Francisco. The government is talking about distributing money directly to American citizens, all American citizens, up to a certain economic level, which is fascinating considering that there are going to be, at this point at least, seemingly great swathes of the nation which appear to be untouched, at least directly, by the coronavirus. Of course, we should consider that what you're having is national decisions made by organizations to effectively close down. So you're seeing the closing of cafeterias, of restaurants, for example. So you are seeing a knock-on effect that whilst the coronavirus does not necessarily appear to be affecting all parts of the nation directly, you are certainly seeing a knock-on indirect impact of this, which is certainly affecting businesses and livelihoods. And the great fear, of course, just as with the Great Depression, is that whilst most Americans don't own stock, for example, the collapse in the American stock market and the ensuing impact that will have upon businesses, business closures, business confidence, and upon 401k pension funds could end up having a hugely detrimental impact upon the American economy, the American society. And it's interesting to see the Fed today announcing that they're taking great steps in an attempt to prevent another great depression, effectively, by buying up stocks and bonds, et cetera, in an attempt to prop up the markets.
I'd like to address the stimulus package that's been going through the motions this last weekend. We've had very sort of limited news of it here, if you're not following American news channels and otherwise. In the UK, there's very much a sense, in terms of the language at least, that whilst the 2008 bailout was focused on big business and banks, the 2020 bailout, as far as the UK is concerned, will be focused on the quote-unquote people. The headline of the impression of the stimulus package put forward in the United States this weekend appears to give the sense that it was very much a 2008-style big business banks bailout. Your thoughts therein, please.
Yeah, it's interesting considering, this. I think that what you're seeing in terms of the difference between how the Conservative administration in London is approaching this and that which has been adopted by the White House and extension the Republicans in Congress is another example of the differences between the approach. As you rightly point out, I think that what Downing Street has done is to learn from 2008 and the visceral reaction against that, the feeling that back then it was the banks that were bailed out on all too many occasions, and that it was up to the banks to then pass on those benefits to the British people. And a very similar approach was taken here in the United States. It was believed that whilst Wall Street was bailed out, Main Street was left wanting. And I think that what you're seeing is that conflict play out in real time in Congress. The bailout package, which has been debated over the weekend, which failed to pass due to a lack of Democratic support, was seen, I think, to be following that pattern of offering too much aid to the banking sector and not enough support and assistance to average citizens. The Republican hopes to do that were actually hindered, bizarrely enough, by the fact that members of the Republican Senate have actually had to quarantine themselves, so they couldn't be there in the chamber to vote full stop, which immediately lowered the number of Republicans in the chamber required to have passed that legislation anyway. So we've got a real challenge at the moment. At this point, there's a logjam. There's going to be more debates and a potential vote later on today. And it's possible that you might get some movement on that. But to do so, the Republican leadership is really going to have to acquiesce to Democratic demands that this is a far more broad-reaching financial package, because, quite frankly, they are nowhere near the numbers required to get this through the United States Senate at this point.
Thank you, James. My final question to you tonight. Last week, when you featured on the Voicing the World podcast, we discussed the importance of putting all of this frequently into historical context. As far as Trump's presidential effort here is concerned, he was quick to celebrate his effort on the Friday just gone, where he spoke to 12,000 CEOs and pledged trillions of dollars to help this situation. I wonder what's your, in historical context, what your analysis is of week one of Trump's fireside briefings in the first crisis of his presidency that wasn't, in the first instance at least, self-made.
You know, it's funny. If you look back through the history of the American presidency, those presidents who have emerged and been remembered are often those who are in office during a crisis and who rise to the occasion. One can think in recent years, or at least the more modern era, of JFK during the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example. You could think of Franklin Roosevelt during the Great Depression. There are others, of course. And it's notable that some presidents who were not necessarily thought of in the same league as FDR or Kennedy or Lincoln have, to some extent, risen to the occasion. And whilst he's not universally beloved, I think it's recognized that George W. Bush, I think, was able to rise to the occasion following 9/11, especially when he went to New York and grabbed the bullhorn and made that speech on the back of an upturned fire truck, which seemed to galvanize the nation at that point. Here we are now with Donald Trump, and for 3.5 years, people have been questioning his ability to rise to the moment in a crisis. And I think that he's seen to have done universally badly during this time period. He has not made great use of what Theodore Roosevelt called the bully pulpit. For someone who has prided himself on his communication skills and his ability to connect with the American people, I think we've seen a very poor ability to do that, quite frankly. He has not used the mechanism of the White House to his great advantage. He has great tools available at his disposal. The ability to address the nation from the Oval Office, which he decided to use last week, was seen to have been a calamitous event, quite frankly, as he seemed to stumble, being unable to read from his own script. The speech seemed to have been cobbled together at the last minute without any great ability to weave together important ideas or concepts. We've seen his briefings from the press briefing room. Again, not an ideal setting for a president. This is a small room, a cramped room. It's been stripped back to let even less members of the Fourth Estate in to try to mitigate the impact of this virus. Usually when a president speaks at times of national emergency in a larger setting, you would imagine that the East Room would have been used, quite frankly, a much grander setting for presidential addresses. It just seems that every time the president opens his mouth at the moment, you're seeing a drop in the stock market and a decline in support and enthusiasm for what it is he has to say. I think that he is surrounded by people who are trying to give him the best advice possible. Scholars, academics, medical professions, but he seems to be unable to get his head around the seriousness of this, and it's trying to diminish it. Now, I recognize that part of the American president's job is to try to offer enthusiasm and encouragement and put a good face upon this and to talk up the nation. But I think there is a sense, quite frankly, that the president either doesn't get or is underplaying the severity of this crisis. And when you've seen presidents in the past rise to the occasion, they have done so. They've done so with the use of rhetoric and oratory, which has been remembered down the ages. One can note Franklin Roosevelt's first inaugural when he famously declared that all we have to fear is fear itself. John F. Kennedy speaking in his inaugural and in his address to the nation during the Cuban Missile Crisis, offering calming words, decisive words. Quite frankly, at this point, it's difficult to think of anything that Donald Trump has said of a positive nature that will be long remembered at this point. And it's fascinating to think that even when he is presented with softball questions by members of the media, which would allow him to come back and to try to calm the nerves of the American people when asked about why Americans might be scared or what he has to say to Americans who might be scared, he instead chooses this as an opportunity to attack the media. And one wonders about who is advising him and what his natural inclination is and why he feels the need to go on the attack so often when this really is a tremendous, I'm sorry to say, opportunity for President Trump to be presidential and to distinguish himself from his obvious Democratic opponent in November, Joe Biden. He gets to speak from the White House every day. He has the opportunity to drive policy and to be seen to be leading the nation. And quite frankly, what you're seeing is an effective abdication of that. You know, he has said categorically that he refuses to accept responsibility for this. And whilst nobody is blaming Donald Trump necessarily for the virus in and of itself, very clearly what he is doing is not assuming the responsibility of the chief executive officer of the nation, and appears to be very willing to sort of pass this down to governors and to blame the Chinese for this, quite frankly, anybody. And I think it's going to be very telling what happens in the coming days and weeks and months. The longer this drags out, history would reveal that the longer this goes on, the more politically damaging this will be for President Trump, as people start to raise serious questions about whether more could have been done earlier. To paraphrase from the Watergate investigation, what did the president know and when did he know it? That could very easily be turned into, at what point did the president know about this virus and when could he have done more about it? Very clearly, I think that you're starting to see a state-by-state recognition that there needs to be a 2-week clampdown upon the movement of people. We've seen the national borders effectively sealed in large part, but not completely. We're starting to see the clampdown on movements within the largest states here in the country. We are still to see that absolute directive come from the White House. And I think one will have to draw conclusions as to why that is. But I think you're seeing great hesitancy on the part of the president to instigate a national lockdown for fears of a political pushback and blowback come the election of November.
Until next Monday then, this has been the American Chronicle, with music by Chris Warner. I'm Michael L. Roberts. Follow Dr. James D. Boyes on the links below. Be sure to tune in on Thursday to the Voice in the World show. And good luck, and ever onward to you all.